Spring 1945. Europe lay in ruins. Cities that once prided themselves on their architecture were now wrecked. Charred houses, collapsed bridges, broken sidewalks where children used to play. Smoke from fires rose into the sky, mixing with the smell of ash, blood, and gunpowder. On the streets, only a few figures hurried past, eyes full of fear and exhaustion, like shadows of their former lives. In a small POW camp, surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by American soldiers, a group of German women had gathered. Some were barely 20, others over 30, all worn down by hunger, cold, and endless fear. Their faces were pale, hands trembling, eyes reflecting fatigue that couldn't be hidden. Each woman carried an invisible burden of war, fear for their family, loss of friends, the destruction of their homes. That day, an American general entered the camp. Tall, with a straight posture and a spotless uniform, he moved confidently, his gaze sharp and observant. His footsteps echoed across the stone yard. The women, accustomed to humiliation and cruelty, froze, watching him warily. Nobody dared move. The general stopped in front of them, looked at each one, and spoke words that seemed like they could change their fate. "You have your freedom. You may go." At first there was silence. The air felt thick. Time seemed to slow. The women glanced at one another, disbelief in their eyes. Some smiled through tears, thinking of going home. But fear and doubt were stronger. Where to go? What awaited them at home? Could they find themselves again in a world they barely recognized? Hannah, a young woman with ragged hair and dirt-stained hands, clenched her fists and whispered to her neighbor, We can't go back." Her words echoed quietly in the hearts of the others. Inside each woman, a spark of doubt, courage, and defiance flared. They understood the freedom offered wasn't just a chance to leave, but a test of whether they could stay true to themselves while the world around them crumbled. For a moment, it seemed the camp held its breath, waiting for their decision. Freedom stood before them, but its cost was unknown. They understood sometimes true freedom isn't the chance to leave, but the courage to stay. After the general spoke, a soft murmur broke the silence. The women began whispering to each other, some crying, some just taking deep breaths, trying to handle the sudden storm of emotions. From the outside, the camp seemed calm, but inside, each woman was waging a personal war as fierce as the one raging beyond Europe's walls. Hannah, who had been the first to voice her doubts, sat on a bench, head lowered. Her hands shook, fingers gripping a piece of old, torn cloth, the only memory of home. She thought of her mother, from whom she hadn't heard in months, and her sister, who she might never see again. Suddenly, Lisa, a few years older with eyes showing weariness and resolve, came over. She sat beside Hannah and quietly said, "Hannah, we can't just go." They promised freedom. But what kind of freedom is that if all we face is ruin, hunger, and shame back home? The women started recalling. Starving cities, bombings, lost friends and family. Terrible choices they had been forced to make. Each carried not only the weight of her own actions, but the guilt of a country they no longer felt part of. Meanwhile, the American general observed from a distance. He understood. These women had already endured too much, and the offered freedom was almost abstract to them. He stepped closer, quietly, not to disturb their inner world. "I know it's hard, but you decide for yourselves what freedom means." Hannah lifted her head. Her eyes met the general's. She said nothing, but in her gaze was resolve. Going back meant betray herself. The sun sank lower, casting the camp in orange red light. The women stayed in place, silently contemplating the world that had fallen apart around them. Nobody rushed their choice. Inside each, a storm of doubt, fear, and hope raged. That night promised to be long. Each woman knew that tomorrow they would have to make a decision that could change their whole life. Night fell over the camp, wrapping it in a gray, cold blanket. The walls seemed taller, the barbed wire more menacing, and the torchlight on the guard towers barely a flicker in the darkness. The wind carried the smell of smoke and decay, a reminder that the war hadn't left even the outskirts of shattered Europe. The women lay on straw and filthy blankets, but no one could sleep. Every rustle, every creaking board felt like a signal of danger. The silence was deceptive. It hid the anxiety that wouldn't let them rest for a single minute. Hannah sat at the edge of her makeshift bed, hugging her knees, trying to sort her thoughts. Images of her hometown flooded her mind. Ruined houses, empty streets, broken schools and playgrounds where laughter once rang out. She thought of her mother, perhaps waiting for her return, and her sister, whose connection had been lost at the start of the war. Every image brought pain, mixed with guilt for surviving when others didn't. Lisa came to Hannah with a mug of warm water, sat down and softly said, "You know, when the general told us we had freedom, I felt relief for the first time in a long while. But now, I get it. Freedom isn't just going wherever you want. It starts here, inside us. We have to choose what our life will be." Hannah nodded. Her mind was a whirlwind. Fear and the desire to live battled each other. Going home meant facing a ruined homeland, old acquaintances who might judge, and the prospect of hunger and poverty. Staying here in the Allied camp was a chance to start over, but in a foreign land, among people who might still see her as an enemy. In the camp, women began gathering in small groups, quietly discussing the future. They whispered, careful not to disturb others or alert the guards. Their conversations were filled with fear, doubt, and rare glimpses of hope. One woman, Marta, recalled life in Berlin. "Nothing's left there. My home's burned, and I'm scared that if I go back, all I'll find is emptiness." "And here?" Another asked. "Here we're strangers, but at least we're alive. We can build something new." Outside the camp, distant gunshots and muffled artillery echoed. It reminded them that the war wasn't over, that every day still demanded choices. Between life and death, submission and defiance. The women's inner storms mirrored the destruction of the world around them. Hannah stared at the stars, barely visible through smoke and clouds. She knew the road ahead would be long, and that the choice they would make at dawn would shape the rest of their lives. Inside her, a realization grew. Freedom wasn't just a chance to leave. It was the ability to keep oneself intact, despite the horror and chaos surrounding them. The night dragged on, seemingly endless. Yet with the first rays of sunlight, the camp began to stir. Women woke, dressed, and whispered to each other, preparing for the day that would determine their fate. Inside each of them, resolve had taken root. None could afford to remain as they were, for the life they had known had died along with the old world. Morning brought a soft, cold light filtering through clouds of smoke and ash. Women rose slowly. Some clutched old blankets for warmth. Others quietly cried, trying to contain their emotions. The camp gradually came to life. Soldiers on the towers watched the grounds, issuing morning orders, while women gathered their meager belongings, stored in cloth sacks and boxes. Hannah walked across the yard, feeling every step, the ground cold and wet from an unnoticed night rain. She thought about her conversation with Lisa yesterday, and the heavy weight that had hung over her soul. Everything around, the ruined barracks, dark corners of warehouses, and charred trees, seemed to reflect her inner state, broken yet alive. Lisa approached her, quietly saying, "Today, we have to decide who we are now. It's not just about where we go. It's about who we want to become." At that moment, Marta joined them. She looked tired, but her eyes shone with determination. "I won't go home," she said firmly. "Everything I knew is gone. Here, there's a chance to start over, even from scratch." The women began discussing practical matters. Who could find work, where to live, how to secure a safer place in a foreign land. Their talk was tinged with anxiety and doubt, but every word carried a desire to live differently, not as prisoners of the past. The American general appeared again in the camp. His face bore the usual stern mask, but his eyes betrayed a quiet interest. He came closer, but did not interfere in the discussion. "The choice is yours," he said. "No one can make you go home if you don't want to." Hannah looked at the women around her and realized this wasn't just a choice between leaving and staying. It was a choice between fear and freedom, between being a pawn in someone else's game and being the master of her own life. All day, the camp buzzed with quiet, tense anticipation. Women helped each other gather their things, preparing to relocate if they chose to stay, while simultaneously grappling with internal doubts. Every thought of home, family, and the past felt simultaneously tangible and unreachable. As the sun neared the horizon, the camp fell into a stillness. Women stood by the walls, gazing into the distance, knowing that tomorrow they would make the final decision. No words from the general, no promise of freedom could ease this choice. It had to come from within, from the heart, where fear and hope intertwined into a single thread leading to the future. The night before the decision was restless. Women settled in the camp, but sleep eluded them. Cold and fatigue couldn't drown the anxiety raging inside. Every whisper wind, every creaking board felt like a signal demanding attention. Hannah sat hugging her knees, pondering what freedom truly meant. Images of her war-torn hometown clashed with visions of the Allied camp, a place where life could begin anew. But what was life without the past? Could she simply leave her home, her family, her friends, and step into the unknown? Lisa, seeing Hannah's torment, sat beside her. "You know," she said softly, "fear is natural. We grew up in one country, but the war showed us everything we believed in is destroyed. We'll have to choose not just between home and safety, but between the life we knew and the life we want to live." Hannah nodded. She thought about what it meant to be free. Freedom wasn't just the absence of chains. It was the ability to be oneself. But being oneself in a world shattered to pieces seemed almost impossible. Other women slowly joined, some holding hands with neighbors, others silently praying. Each battled her own fears and doubts. They understood. Tomorrow marked a new life, and the decision would change everything. The American general approached the group once more. His gaze was calm, almost gentle. "No one is forcing you home," he said. "You choose your path." Hannah felt a strange relief, though fear still lingered. She realized that freedom wasn't a gift. It was a trial. Evening came, and women gathered around a small fire to warm themselves. The flames reflected in their eyes, mixing hope with doubt. They shared stories of loss, fear, and desires. Within these stories lay courage, the quiet courage that would help them make their choice. The night seemed infinite, but they knew morning would bring clarity. Each woman understood. Tomorrow, they would make a decision shaping the rest of their lives. No threat, no promise could change this fact. The choice belonged solely to them. Early morning brought a pale light, barely piercing the fog and smoke shrouding the camp. The air was cold and damp, reminding the women of the night's chill and the anxiety that hadn't left them. Every movement felt heavy. The straw underfoot creaked, old camp boards groaned under the weight of tired bodies, and every shadow seemed to whisper echoes of past. Hannah walked across the yard, watching the other women gather in small groups, discussing plans, seeking some measure of certainty. Her mind was tangled with contradictions. Home, family, the past, or life here in a foreign land, with a chance to start over. She sensed that fear was not her enemy, but a companion showing her the truth. Lisa came up to Hannah with a warm, gentle look. "Today we have to choose not just between leaving and staying. We have to choose who we will be. Not just survive, but really live." Hannah nodded. Her mind whirled between fear and hope, but her heart slowly found foothold. She realized that the true trial wasn't just physical endurance. It was maintaining herself when everything around her collapsed. The American general again appeared at a distance, giving them space to make their decisions. His words from yesterday and today acted as quiet support. "No one is forcing you home. Your choice is yours alone." Some women, including Marta, began quietly discussing practical steps. Where to find work, how to set up a home, how to create a safe place for a new life. Others hesitated, still wrestling with fear and attachment to the past. Then a whisper cut through the camp. "I will stay here." Those words were like a shaft of light through the darkness. Gradually, other women began agreeing, some daring to stay, some realizing that the past could not be reclaimed. Their choices were not simple, but they were conscious. The day slowly approached noon, and the camp filled with a sense of quiet anticipation. Women prepared for the next stage of life. Some ready to start over here among ruins, but with freedom and independence. Others confronting the difficult path back into uncertainty. Hannah understood that the decision affected more than herself. It influenced the women who would become her companions in this trial, those watching them, and the world that was about to receive their new path. Noon stretched slowly across the camp. The sun barely pierced through the smoke-filled clouds, illuminating the broken walls and barbed wire, casting long, dark shadows across the ground. Women gathered in small groups, quietly discussing their decisions. Many still doubted, trying to find meaning between past and future, between fear and the desire to live freely. Hannah sat at the edge of the yard, leaning against an old crate. Her gaze wandered over the other women, some packing their things, some quietly praying, some simply standing, trying to understand what it meant to be free. Inside her, conflicting emotions raged. Fear of the unknown, guilt for those who hadn't survived, and a fragile hope that life could be different real. Lisa came up to Hannah, holding a bundle of a few personal belongings. "I know," she said softly. "It's scary, leaving everything behind, stepping into the unknown. But can we let the past keep ruling us? Do we want to go back to empty streets, ruined homes, a world where every step is a fight for survival?" Hannah listened, feeling Lisa's words slowly push aside the walls of her fear. Something inside was shifting, quietly, almost imperceptibly, but with growing certainty. She understood that freedom didn't arrive by itself. It had to be accepted, earned. At that moment, Marta approached. She looked tired, but determination burned in her eyes. "I've decided to stay," she said. "My life cannot be just a shadow of the past. Here, there's a chance to be alive, not just surviving." Her words sounded like a quiet bell of change. Other women began whispering to each other. Some still hesitated, but could no longer deny the same feeling growing within them. The desire to start life anew, to take responsibility for themselves and their choices. The general watched from afar, not intervening. He knew that true freedom was not in orders or promises, but in a person's ability to decide for themselves, to go against habit and make choices that reflected their inner world. Hannah felt her heart fill with resolve. She realized that going back to destroyed Germany might be physically safer, but emotionally, it was a deadly maze. Here, among those who had endured as much pain and fear, she could be herself. The day moved toward evening. Women continued gathering their few belongings, helping each other, quietly sharing stories of loss, fears, and desires. Within these stories lay courage, silent, but speaking of readiness for a new life. When the sun slowly sank behind the horizon, the camp was cast into long shadows. Women gathered around the fire, watching the flames reflected in their eyes. The fire mingled with their doubts, fears, and hopes, creating the feeling that this flame symbolized their inner world. Weak, yet alive, ready to fight and survive. Hannah realized that everything would change tomorrow. The decision was made to stay, start over, build a new life where destruction met opportunity. It was a decision of courage, requiring strength of spirit, honesty with oneself, and readiness to face the unknown. Night fell slowly, but in the hearts of the women, a quiet, firm sense grew. They were free, not because someone offered it to them, but because they chose it themselves. The morning of a new day arrived. The camp was bathed in soft light, but the cold remained, a reminder of the harsh post-war reality. The women no longer sat in the shadow of their doubts. They were preparing for the life they had chosen. Every movement, every gathered item felt like a small step toward a new life, a life where they would determine their own fates. Hannah woke earlier than the others. She stood at the edge of the camp, watching the first rays of sunlight playing across ruined buildings and barbed wire. Inside her heart was a quiet sense of confidence. For the first time in months, she thought about freedom. It doesn't come instantly. It requires strength, resolve, and the willingness to face the unknown. Lisa approached with a mug of warm water. "We've made our choice," she said softly, "and now real life begins." Hannah nodded, feeling determination growing inside. She understood that staying here didn't just mean surviving. It meant building, creating, and taking responsibility for every step she took. This was a trial, not of the body, but of the soul. The women began preparing to move. Those who decided to stay gathered their meager belongings, helping one another, sharing guidance, quiet support, and the budding friendship born from shared fear and pain. They knew the future was uncertain, but now they had a foundation. They had each other. The general watched from a distance. He saw that every woman had made her decision, based on inner strength and understanding that freedom is not a gift. It is a choice that must be made. He didn't intervene, knowing that true courage shows when someone chooses their path without being directed. Hannah approached Marta and Lisa. "We can do this together," she said. "We survived the war. We can survive this too." They nodded, understanding the road ahead would be difficult. But it was theirs. Each knew they were no longer prisoners of a camp, a country, or a war. They were free because they had chosen freedom themselves. When the women left the camp, the ruined world lay behind them. Ahead was a path they were building themselves, a path of hope, strength, and human dignity. They departed under the pale morning sun. The ground beneath their feet was wet with dew, the air cold and crisp, as if nature itself welcomed their new life. Each step was cautious, yet already carried confidence. They had made their choice, and now they walked a road of their own making. Hannah held Lisa's hand, while Marta walked beside them, clutching a bundle of her most precious belongings. Their steps felt heavy, not from tiredness, but from the weight of memories, the days they had endured. Yet with each step, a lightness grew, born from the awareness that they were now free. They passed through ruined villages, where buildings stood half destroyed and streets were empty. Occasionally, they saw people just as weary, just as frightened. The women understood that the world around them was still full of fear and pain, but now they had an inner sense of control. They were choosing their own path, and that gave them strength to keep moving forward. Hannah glanced back at the camp. The walls, barbed wire, and memories of fear and pain were behind them. Beyond those walls lay only the past. Ahead was a new path they could shape themselves. Marta spoke quietly. "We're alive, and we're going to build our lives, even if it's hard." Hannah nodded, feeling the power in those words. They walked together, supporting one another, understanding that freedom was not only the right to leave, but the responsibility for every step, every decision, every choice. The day was long, but each woman knew this path was theirs. No threat, no pain, no past could force them to turn back. They were free because they had chosen freedom, and that feeling was stronger than anything they had ever known. Evening fell, coloring the ruined villages and forests in golden red tones. The women had been walking for hours, yet their steps became lighter. Not because the journey shortened, but because an inner sense of freedom grew. They looked at each other and saw reflected the strength rarely found in a world torn apart by war. Hannah paused at the edge of a small clearing, turning to survey the path they had traveled. The camp lay behind them, a symbol of the past, fear, pain, and humiliation. Ahead lay land where they could build a life of their own, without commands from others, without living under someone else's fear. Lisa sat down beside her. "We did it," she said quietly. "We chose ourselves. That's what matters most." Marta smiled, feeling the first relief in a long time. "Yes, we're free, but freedom is only the beginning. Now we have to live, and we'll manage." The women sat in the clearing, watching the sun set on the horizon. In that sunset was no ending, only a promise of a new life, full of their own choices, strength, and hope. Each felt it deeply. Freedom hadn't come as a gift. It had been earned through fear, doubt, and inner struggle. Hannah stood and looked at her friends. "We keep moving. Together. Nothing can break us now." They walked on again, each step a symbol of their strength, determination, and human dignity. The past was left behind, and ahead lay a world they could shape themselves. A world where they were free, not because anyone let them be, but because they had chosen this path themselves. Under the golden European sunset, the group of women who had survived the horrors of war finally felt what they had been searching for: true freedom, strength of spirit, and the chance to be themselves. Each step forward carried the weight of their past, but also the power of choice. Every ruined village, every abandoned street, reminded them of what they had endured. Yet they moved with growing confidence, for they had decided their own fate. Hannah, Lisa, and Marta walked side by side, silently sharing the sense that this journey was theirs alone. They no longer needed permission, orders, or approval. The world behind them was destroyed, but the road ahead was theirs to shape. Evening light stretched long shadows across the land. The women's eyes reflected both exhaustion and determination. In each glance, a quiet understanding. Freedom wasn't just leaving a camp or surviving. It was claiming the right to choose, to act, to live fully despite the past. They paused briefly in a small field, taking in the horizon. The wind carried the faint scent of smoke, reminders of destruction and loss, yet also a promise of life. Marta spoke softly. "Look at us. We survived. We chose. That's everything." Hannah nodded, feeling the truth in her chest. They were no longer prisoners of the war, of their country, or of circumstance. They were free because they had chosen freedom themselves. The sun dipped lower, bathing the fields in warm light. They continued walking, side by side, each step a declaration of resilience. The past lay behind them, heavy and real, but it no longer controlled them. Ahead was a future they're making, fragile but full of possibility. The night was falling, yet in the hearts of the women a quiet, unwavering feeling grew. They were free, not because someone granted it, but because they had chosen it themselves. Morning broke over the camp. Soft light bathed the ruins, though the cold reminded them of the harsh reality of the post-war world. The women no longer sat in the shadow of their doubts. They were preparing for the life they had chosen. Every movement, every gathered item felt like a small step toward a new life, a life where they determined their own fate. Hannah awoke earlier than the others. Standing at the edge of the camp, she watched the first sunlight play across broken buildings and barbed wire. Inside her heart, a quiet confidence stirred. For the first time in months, she understood that freedom does not come instantly. It requires strength, resolve, and the courage to face the unknown. Lisa approached with a mug of warm water. "We've made our choice," she said softly, "and now real life begins." Hannah nodded, determination growing inside. Staying here meant more than surviving. It meant building, creating, and taking responsibility for every step. It was a test not of body, but of the soul. The women gathered their belongings, helping one another, sharing guidance, quiet support, and the budding friendship born from shared fear and pain. Though the road ahead was uncertain, they had a foundation. They had each other. The general watched from afar. He saw that each woman had made her decision based on inner strength and the understanding that freedom is not a gift. It is a choice to be made. He did not intervene, knowing true courage lies in choosing one's path without direction. Hannah turned to Marta and Lisa. "We can do this together," she said. "We survived the war. We can survive this too." They nodded, knowing the road ahead would be hard, but it was theirs. No longer prisoners of a camp, a country, or a war. They were free because they had chosen freedom themselves. As they left the camp, the ruined world behind them, a new path stretched forward, a path of hope, strength, and human dignity. Walking under the pale morning sun, the ground wet with dew and the air crisp, they carried the weight of memories, but also the lightness of having chosen their destiny. Through ruined villages and empty streets, they passed, occasionally meeting others as weary and frightened as themselves. They understood that the world remained full of fear and pain, but now they had control of their own journey. They were choosing their path, and that gave them the strength to keep moving. Pausing in a small clearing, Marta spoke quietly. "We're alive, and we're going to build our lives, even if it's hard." Hannah nodded, feeling the power in her words. They moved forward together, supporting each other, understanding that freedom was not only the right to leave, but the responsibility for every step, every decision, every choice. Evening came, coloring the land in gold and red. The women's steps became lighter, not because the journey shortened, but because inner freedom grew. They looked at each other, seeing reflected the rare strength found in a world torn apart by war. Hannah paused, looking back at the camp, a symbol of past fear, pain, and humiliation. Ahead lay land where they could build a life of their own, without orders, without fear. Lisa sat beside her. "We did it," she said softly. "We chose ourselves. That's what matters most." Marta smiled, feeling relief for the first time in months. "Yes, we're free, but freedom is only the beginning. Now we have to live, and we'll manage." They watched the sunset together, understanding it wasn't an ending but a promise of new life, full of their own choices, strength, and hope. Freedom had not been given. It had been won through fear, doubt, and inner struggle. Hannah stood, looking at her friends. "We keep moving. Together. Nothing can break us now." And so they walked on, each step a symbol of their strength, determination, and dignity. The past was behind them, and ahead was a world they could shape themselves, a world where they were free, not because anyone allowed it, but because they chose this path themselves. Under the golden European sunset, the women who had survived the horrors of war finally found what they had long sought: real freedom, the strength of spirit, and the ability to be themselves.
One story has ended, but there are many more to come. Subscribe to stay up to date with the next story.